Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the BRLSI and the World Affairs series. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I've got various roles here. I'm the convener for World Affairs, which is today's topic. I'm also the convener for philosophy, and I'm also the co-chair of management here at the BRLSI. So a warm welcome to all of you. I know the weather outside is pretty cold, so we're not insisting on having the windows open today, so you'll be pleased about that. So before I go on and introducing our main event, Larry, which is to today's talk, which is about democracy erodes from the top, which is quite apt, quite relevant, and quite frightening to some extent in terms of the global perspective. And I'm sure you will have lots of questions for Larry afterwards. But before we do, there's a couple of things I need to just tell people in the room, and that's really only one question around the fire procedure. So in all my tenure here, the fire alarm has never rang during a lecture. So that's a surefire thing. It might ring today, but I don't think it will. If it does, I just tell you, if you could make yourself downstairs again in an orderly manner, through the stairs you came up from, through the front of the building, out of the door, turn right, and then turn right again at the end of the road and congregate at College Green, just by the chapel there. So that is all we need to know for the fire evacuation procedures. That's all you need to know in the room. And obviously, Larry will take questions at the end of his talk. So that should be quite interesting. Okay, now for those of you who are online, you don't have any fire evacuation procedures, so you're all on your own, I'm afraid, wherever you are. But in terms of asking questions, there's three ways of doing that. The first way is by just unmuting yourself and showing a video at the end of the talk, not before the end of the talk. Raise your hand and I will pick you out and you can ask your question in person. Alternatively, you can raise your hand electronically in Zoom and I'll pick you out to ask a question. And the final way of doing it is by actually posting something in the chat room, which you can either then ask the question in person or I can read out on your behalf. And that's really it as far as the admin is concerned. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Larry Birtles to you, all the way from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. This is the wonder of modern technology post-COVID, that we can actually have speakers join us from all around the world. And what an eminent speaker he is. Professor Birtles got his degree from Yale University, his doctorate from University Berkeley, I think in America you say, California. And he's been a prolific author of various books. And one of the books in 2016 was Democracy for the Realists. So that probably gave you a bit of a hint in terms of where he was going to track in the subsequent years. And obviously his new book, Democracy Erodes from the Top, is his latest and explores the notions of populism amongst leaders, citizens, and in Europe in particular. But I'm sure we will get on to the rest of the world as well. So please all put your hands together for a warm welcome for Larry Birtles.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, albeit remotely. My topic is Democracy Erodes from the Top, Leaders, Citizens, and the Challenge of Populism in Europe. The talk is based on a new book, was published just a couple of weeks ago. So I hope you'll all get a chance to look at that at some point. The starting point for me, I've mostly spent my career studying American politics, but turned to European politics several years ago in response to what I took to be a widespread perception of crisis, a crisis of democracy globally, but especially in Europe. And I just want to start with reminding you of some of the perspectives about the state of democracy in Europe. Matt O'Brien, an analyst for the Washington Post, wrote, "It shouldn't be too surprising that the worst economic crisis since the 1930s," speaking now of the Euro crisis, has led to the worst political crisis within liberal democracies since the 1930s. A European editor for the Washington Post wrote, "The Western democracies now seem in danger of collapsing as a backlash against globalization arouses angry opponents of immigration, free trade, and cultural tolerance." A noted public intellectual wrote that there are times in which everything changes all at once. Political newcomers storm the stage. Voters clamor for policies that were unthinkable until yesterday. Social tensions that had long simmered under the surface erupt into terrifying explosions. A system of government that had seemed immutable looks as though it might come apart. This is the kind of moment in which we now find ourselves. Well, that sounds dramatic, certainly, the kind of thing that appeals to journalists and is likely to get traction in public discourse. But there's similar kind of rhetoric in academia as well. One of the most prominent scholars of comparative politics, Adam Jaworski, wrote, "Something is happening. Anti-establishment, anti-system, anti-elite populist sentiments are exploding in many mature democracies. Confidence in politicians, parties, parliaments, and governments is falling. Even the support for democracy as a system of government has weakened." Well, when I started looking at this set of conditions several years ago, that was the kind of picture that I expected to see, looking at European public opinion. But I was surprised to find that, in fact, ordinary Europeans' political attitudes have changed remarkably little over the past 20 years. If there's a crisis of democracy in Europe, either it's a crisis of such long standing that it may not make sense to think of it as a crisis at all, or it's something that really doesn't have to do with public opinion, which has really been mostly unchanged. And so what I'm going to do is to run you through patterns of opinion with respect to a variety of attitudes that have been implicated in what has been called the wave of right-wing populism in Europe and in the world more broadly, and the crisis of democracy. Attitudes toward immigrants, European integration, trust in politicians and parties, satisfaction with the economy, and with the workings of democracy. And it's going to turn out that across Europe over the last 20 years, most of those attitudes have remained essentially unchanged. And when they've changed at all, they've actually improved rather than having gotten worse. And the data for this analysis comes from a treasure trove of survey data, a project called the European Social Surveys, which have been conducted in 23 countries across Europe over the last 20 years. There have been 9 waves of the survey. You can see the list of countries there. Most of them have participated in all 9 waves, and so we have data roughly every 2 years from most of these countries. Some of them haven't participated every 2 years, and so we have partial data for those. And altogether, there are about 350,000 survey respondents answering a standard set of questions across these countries over this period. And what I want to do is to start by showing you just in general what the trends in opinion have looked like. I'll start with a scale that I created about people's attitudes toward immigrants and immigration. This is an average of 6 different specific measures that were included in these surveys. And like all of these measures that I'm going to show you, this runs from a value of 0 at the bottom for people who are most hostile to immigrants and immigration to 10 at the top for people who are most favorable. The thin gray lines in the picture here show you the trends for individual countries, looking at the countries that have been included in all 9 waves of the survey over this 18-year period. And the heavy red line is the average for Europe as a whole, the average level of favorability toward immigrants in Europe as a whole. You can see on the whole, it's right about in the middle of the scale and actually gradually increases over this entire period. The overall increase amounts to about 0.4 of a point on this 0 to 10 scale. If you look under the hood at what's happening here, it turns out that a lot of the increase reflects a pattern of generational replacement. On the whole, in Europe, young people are a good deal more favorable toward immigrants and immigration than older people are. And so part of what's happened over this 20 period is that a lot of older people with negative attitudes toward immigration have been replaced in the electorate by younger people who have more favorable attitudes on the whole. And that's true in most of the countries considered individually as well, even the ones where overall attitudes toward immigration are still relatively cool. The other thing you should note here is that there's virtually no reaction at all to the huge refugee crisis of 2015 and 16. In spite of a dramatic influx of refugees in some of these countries, overall support for immigrants and immigration has continued to increase. And that's been true even in places that have seen huge increases in immigration. Sweden, for example, is the very top line in the picture here, the most favorable attitudes toward immigrants anywhere in Europe. You can see around 2016 a dip in the favorability of Sweden's attitudes toward immigration in response to the frictions that arose with the refugee crisis. But there's actually been something of a rebound since then, and Sweden remains most favorable in Europe in its attitude toward immigrants in spite of the big influx. A similar kind of picture with respect to support for European integration. This is a question that asks people whether they would prefer to see a continued expansion of European integration or not. You can see again, the attitudes on the whole are mildly favorable. There was some dip in support for European integration during the worst part of the Euro crisis. That's entirely rebounded, and so now the average level of support is a little bit higher than it was at the beginning of this period. If you look at the countries in which there has been a general decline in support for European integration, it turns out not to be consistent with a kind of common story that people have been disillusioned by the unwillingness or inability of European authorities to deal with the economic crisis. In fact, the countries where support for European integration has declined most noticeably are the countries in Central Europe that joined the EU in the early 2000s and were in the first flush of enthusiasm, and their enthusiasm has declined over time, not really for economic reasons, because they're among the countries that actually survived the Euro crisis most successfully in economic terms, but because of cultural frictions and social frictions of one kind or another, and in some cases because of pretty enthusiastic anti-EU rhetoric on the part of political leaders like Orban in Hungary. So overall, there was some dip in support for European integration during the Euro crisis. Even in the worst part of the Euro crisis, it turns out that Europeans were more enthusiastic about the EU's handling of the crisis than they were about their own national government's handling of the crisis. So maybe it shouldn't be surprised that that didn't create any long-term dent in their enthusiasm for a gradual continuation of the project of European integration. You might be wondering about where Great Britain falls in this picture. It's the narrow, solid line that's for most of the period at the very bottom of the list. That is the least favorable attitudes anywhere in Europe toward further European integration. But even in Europe, you can see even in Great Britain, you can see a rebound in support for European integration that began probably a little bit before the Brexit vote and has continued after the Brexit vote. So even there's been some rebound in enthusiasm for the project of Europe. Ideological polarization has increased very slightly across Europe over this period, a change of 3/100ths of a point on this scale that I'm showing you here. You might think that that polarization reflects an increase in right-wing sentiment across Europe. In fact, most of the increase is due to more extreme views on the left of the ideological spectrum rather than on the right, but overall more or less constant level of polarization across these various countries, and not a huge amount of variation across them either. Trust in parliament and politicians dipped very slightly during the European crisis, but is now rebounded. It's basically exactly at the level that it was before the crisis began, back to the highest level we've seen at any point in the 21st century. The same thing is true for satisfaction with democracy. These are responses to a question in the survey asking people how satisfied they are with the working of democracy in their own countries. You can see some slight ups and downs, but overall, no real change in people's satisfaction with democracy. It's also interesting, both in satisfaction with democracy and in trust in politicians, to see the places where there have been declines, at least short-term declines in political attitudes. Those declines turn out to be strongly correlated with declines in people's economic attitudes, their satisfaction with how the economy is going in their country. And so even those declines that we have seen probably reflect general frustration with the economic situation as much as they do specifically political concerns. So overall, remarkably little change in public opinion over the course of the 21st century. But that raises a puzzle. Where is this wave of support for right-wing populists across Europe coming from if public opinion on all of these attitudes related to support for right-wing populism are essentially unchanged? And the story I want to tell you is that the metaphor of a wave of populist sentiment, which has been ubiquitous in media discussions of this set of issues, is really misleading. And what you should think about is not a wave, but rather a reservoir of populist sentiment that's existed in these countries for a very long time, and indeed in all democratic countries for a very long time. And what's changed is not opinion, but the way that reservoir has been tapped by political elites. So the first thing to say is that the wave itself is exaggerated. Across Europe, support for these right-wing populist parties has really increased only pretty modestly. Here's a picture that summarizes what's going on in lots of individual countries. It looks like a mess of spaghetti. The point is that there are very different stories in very different countries, and lots of dramatic ups, but also a lot of dramatic downs. The overall trend, which is represented by the dotted red line there in the middle of the picture, is that average support for right-wing populist parties in elections has increased from something like 12 or 13% at the beginning of the 21st century to something like 15% in recent elections. So there's some increase there, but by no means the kind of dramatic continent-wide wave that is often portrayed. So why is the press discourse here so misleading? I think mostly it has to do with selective attention to particular cases in which populist parties have found support. If you think about the last year or two, for example, you've probably all heard a lot about Sweden, where right-wing populists have attained new influence, and Italy, where a right-wing populist leader is now the leader of the governing coalition. But you've probably heard much less about places like Slovenia and Norway and Switzerland, where existing right-wing populist parties have actually lost a good deal of electoral support in recent years. Great Britain is kind of a similar example. There was a lot of attention to UKIP at the point where it was having success in the polls. It then basically disappeared after the Brexit vote, and people don't talk about it anymore. But even when it was at its peak, a lot of the support for Brexit seems to have been generated by disproportionate media coverage. Detailed analysis of the relationship between support for UKIP and its level of media coverage suggests that it got more media attention in Britain than it deserved, given its electoral support at any given time. And that extravagant media attention actually generated more support for the party. So it was, at least in part for a while, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in which attention generated support, which generated more attention. I think that's to a greater or lesser extent part of the story in many of these cases where we've heard a lot about specific right-wing populist parties bursting into prominence. The second point that I want to make is that the variation in support for populist parties, where it has increased, has very little to do with the level of public sentiment underlying right-wing populism in particular countries. The variation in electoral performance turns out to have much more to do with what I'll call supply than with the demand for right-wing populism. If you think about the attitudes that do predict support for right-wing populist parties all across Europe in recent years, things like conservative ideology and anti-immigrant sentiment, and to a lesser extent, anti-EU sentiment and political distrust and dissatisfaction with democratic procedures. Those attitudes, as we've seen, are pretty constant, but we can think about the underlying attitudes as a kind of barometer of populist sentiment in a given country that's independent of whether there are right-wing populist parties actually competing for power and how well they're doing electorally. And so what I'm going to show you now is an index of this right-wing populist sentiment. How many people are there in a given time and place who express these conservative political views and anti-immigrant sentiments and anti-EU sentiments and so on, and how does that relate to the level of electoral support for specific right-wing parties? Well, here's what the pattern looks like. You can see that there's virtually no relationship between how much right-wing populist sentiment there is in a given country, reading across the bottom horizontal axis there, scores from 4 to 6 on the 0 to 10 scale, and going up the vertical axis, the average level of electoral support for right-wing populist parties in these same countries. You can see that there are some countries like Switzerland in which there's a lot of support at the polls for right-wing populist parties, even though there's rather little right-wing populist sentiment. There are also places with a good deal of right-wing populist sentiment where right-wing populist parties have really not been all that successful. So the relationship at the level of political systems or individual political parties is really remarkably hit or miss, and turns out to reflect a lot about the decisions of individual political leaders, the workings of specific electoral systems, and the behavior or misbehavior of incumbent parties who, through scandals and just terrible economic and political performance, sometimes have created huge openings for right-wing parties to step in and gain support. If you look at the individual level, here's what the distribution across Europe of right-wing populist sentiment looks like, again, along the bottom, the full scale from 0 to 10. You see that there are some people at the extreme right tail, the people who have the highest levels of right-wing populist sentiment, some people at the opposite extreme, down near 0 and 1 and 2, and overall a kind of bell-shaped curve with most people near the middle of the distribution. I've divided that distribution up into 3 chunks. The people at the top, kind of tannish brown color, are people who are eligible to vote but didn't participate in a given election. The people in the middle, the kind of gold or yellow bars, are the people who voted for mainstream parties of one kind or another in a given political system. And the distribution down at the bottom, the black distribution, is the set of people who actually voted for right-wing populist parties in a given election. You can see that they're somewhat skewed toward the right of the distribution, but even the people who have extreme populist sentiments are really more likely than not to vote for mainstream parties rather than right-wing populist parties. In some cases, that's because there is no right-wing populist party appealing for their support, and so their only real alternative is to vote for a mainstream party. But in lots of other cases, there are right-wing populist parties, and a lot of the people who have sentiments that might incline them to support those parties have remained loyal to more mainstream conservative parties of one kind or another. So one way to summarize this pattern is that politicians haven't yet been very successful in mobilizing the substantial potential demand for right-wing populism across Europe. That's the good news. The bad news is that politicians haven't yet been very successful in mobilizing that right-wing populist sentiment. And so there is, I think, a good deal of potential for further electoral increases in support for right-wing populist parties, depending on the behavior of their leaders, but also depending on the behavior of mainstream political leaders. So that may sound alarming, and people have been alarmed all across Europe and across the country, across the world as a whole. But I think people are concerned about more than just the possibility of these right-wing populist parties winning increased electoral support, and even occasionally, although not very frequently, having some real power through position in a coalition government in one country or another. I think the more important underlying concern here is that people think about this reservoir of right-wing populist sentiment as providing potential support for authoritarians who would significantly undermine the institutions of democracy and democratic procedures as we know them. And the real test cases or warning signals for that kind of concern are Hungary and Poland, both of which have seen substantial democratic backsliding over the past decade or more. I want to give you just a flavor of how this argument works, beginning with the observation about support for right-wing populist parties all over Western Europe, and then turning to Poland and Hungary with the at least implicit concern that what's happened there will happen all across Europe. Far-right populist parties have risen from obscurity to transform the party system of virtually every Western European country. Meanwhile, parts of Central and Eastern Europe bear witness to the institutional and ideological transformations that might be afoot. In Poland and Hungary, populist strongmen have begun to put pressure on critical media to violate minority rights and to undermine key institutions such as independent courts. Well, here's what those processes look like in a broad sense. These are expert ratings of the quality of democracy in different countries over the course of the 21st century from a project called the VDEM project, which rates every country in every year with respect to the level of liberal democracy. And you can see what's happened in Poland, which is the dark blue kind of double line, and in Poland, which is the red solid line, substantial declines over time, beginning in 2010 in Poland with the ascension to power of the Fidesz power under Viktor Orban, and then continuing through the next decade or more. And somewhat later in Poland, beginning in 2015, with the election of the Law and Justice Party, a similar pattern, but with several years delay. You can see how those trends compare with what's happened in other European countries. The dotted line up at the top is an average rating for some typical high-performing democratic countries of Europe, France and Germany and Sweden. You can see that even at the beginning of the century, Poland and Hungary were a little below those levels in terms of the ratings of their democratic performance, but they were certainly much closer to those countries than they were to the middle group of countries that I'm showing you here, Albania and Bulgaria and Romania. And then down at the bottom, you can see what real authoritarian countries look like, places like Belarus and Russia, where the trappings of liberal democracy are basically entirely absent. So on the whole, Hungary and Poland have declined from pretty conventional, although not quite ideal, democracies at the beginning of the 21st century to kind of moderate, quasi-democratic or mildly authoritarian systems later in the century. And how did that happen? I think a common explanation is that waves of right-wing populism swept these authoritarian leaders into power and basically greased the skids for democratic backsliding. But if you look at detail at what happened in these countries, it turns out that those stories really don't fit the facts very well at all. In Poland, in Hungary in 2010, the incumbent party had been discredited for years by a huge corruption scandal in which the party leader was recorded talking about how they had bamboozled the voters into supporting them. There were a couple of years of demonstrations, and the Fidesz party was basically the leading opposition party in this environment where the incumbent party had basically discredited itself. And so one Polish scholar said, one Polish scholar said that the result of the 2010 election was basically foreordained. It seemed to have very little to do with populism. The Fidesz party didn't really run as a populist party, although they had been characterized as mildly populist in a previous stint in government. They basically put those kinds of appeals aside and tried to create a moderate sort of unifying conservative appeal. And if you look at survey data from just before the 2010 election, the people who supported Fidesz really were not any different from other Hungarians in terms of their levels of antipathy to immigrants or antipathy to the European Union or distrust of politicians or parliaments. All of the kind of standard factors that we think about as warning signs of right-wing populist sentiment were basically not absent in Hungary, but unrelated to support for Fidesz at the time that it was elected. It was basically a pretty typical conservative party that got swept into power by the failure of the incumbent party. They won 53% of the vote in that election in 2010, but given the way the Hungarian electoral system works, that 53% of the vote translated into 2/3 of the seats in the National Assembly. As it happens, exactly 2/3 of the seats, which, according to the Hungarian constitution, gave the party, if it could remain unified, the ability to make these changes in the institutions, to fiddle with the electoral system, to crack down on judges, to crack down on the independent media, and so on. And given the highly unified internal state of the Fidesz party, Orbán basically had unified control over the party and controlled who got nominated, and so had a lot of control over their behavior in the assembly. He managed to push through these changes in the constitution. And in retrospect, they referred to the 2010 election as a voting booth revolution, but it was kind of a obviously patched together justification for what they decided to do, an instance of democratic backsliding that really had very little connection to the sentiment that got them elected or the sentiment after they were in power. And then in Poland, several years later, much the same kind of story. A discredited incumbent party, a conservative out party that submerged its populist tendencies and campaigned as a more moderate conservative alternative. The candidate they put forward as prime minister was a miner's daughter who is said to be an avid reader. The support for Law and Justice before the election had very little to do with right-wing populist attitudes, with attitudes about immigration or about the European Union or distrust of incumbent parties and politicians. It was really mostly opposition to the incumbent government. But again, once they were in power, they used the opportunity to crack down and backslide in a way that was troubling and disturbing. But again, troubling and disturbing because of the behavior of the leaders who had the leeway to take these actions, not because there was some external pressure from citizens that was forcing them to behave that way. All of that turns out to be quite consistent with what we've learned about more general breakdowns of democracy from dozens of cases in 20th century Europe and Latin America. And I want to refer here to a couple of quotations from Nancy Bermeo's terrific book called Ordinary People in Extraordinary Times. She says, the culpability for democracy's demise lay overwhelmingly with political elites. In the vast majority of cases, voters did not choose dictatorship at the ballot box. Ordinary people generally were guilty of remaining passive, while they generally did not polarize and mobilize in support of dictatorship. They did not immediately mobilize in defense of democracy either. I think that's true of Hungary and Poland as well. There has been significant opposition to these mildly authoritarian regimes in both places, but also substantial support for them and substantial continued latitude for them to behave in the way that they have. Why is that? Well, I think one answer that's often overlooked is simply that these governments have been quite successful in terms of creating a sense of subjective well-being among their citizens. Here's a summary of survey data on various attitudes in Hungary and Poland, comparing where they were before the authoritarian parties took power in 2009 in Hungary and in 2015 in Poland. This is, in both cases, just months or less than a year before the crucial election that brought the mildly authoritarian governments to power. And then looking at the most recent data from 2018 or 2019. You can see, looking first at Hungary, that satisfaction with the working of the economy has almost tripled over this period, a huge increase. Satisfaction with government has more than doubled, a huge increase. Substantial increase in trust in parliament and politicians. Ironically, a substantial increase in satisfaction with democracy, even as international observers were bemoaning the democratic backsliding in Hungary over this period. And even a substantial increase in satisfaction with life as a whole. This is a measure that moves very slowly over time in any given country. The increase in Hungary over this period, almost a full point on the 0 to 10 scale, is one of the very largest increases we've seen anywhere in Europe over this period. In Poland, a kind of similar pattern, mostly smaller changes, but qualitatively similar increases in satisfaction with the economy, satisfaction with government, trust in parliaments and politicians, an increasing satisfaction with democracy, an increase in the quality, perceived quality of health services and education, although in this case, not a significant decline in satisfaction with life as a whole. But given these at least subjective improvements in the quality of day-to-day life, it maybe shouldn't be surprising that ordinary Hungarians and Poles were willing to put up with some democratic backsliding on the part of their political leaders. And before we are tempted to condemn them, it might be useful to think about what would happen in response to similar circumstances in other parts of the world. It turns out that there's a pretty substantial literature going back in some cases for several decades about people's attitudes about democracy and how important they are. Basically, the pattern is that if you ask people about democracy in the abstract, they're all for it. They attach a lot of importance to how democratic their own political system is. But that turns out to be very flexible in terms of their understanding of how democracy works. So, for example, in China, people on the whole are attach just as much importance to their country being run democratically as people in the United States do. They're also just as likely to say that their country is performing well democratically as people in the United States are. So clearly they have a very different sense of what democracy means. On a more micro level, there have been surveys recently spurred by concerns about anti-democratic sentiment on the part of citizens, in which people are asked to trade off in hypothetical and in some cases in actual choices between political parties that share their substantive preferences and values, but are described as taking anti-democratic actions of one kind or another, or have in fact taken anti-democratic actions of one kind or another, whether people would choose those parties over parties that disagree with them with respect to important substantive issues and political values, but are more purely democratic in their procedural stances. And the general pattern is that people are very willing to trade off democratic procedures for substantive values. If you look in the United States, for example, in the 2022 midterm election, there were scores and scores of Republican members of Congress who had voted to decertify electoral votes after the 2000 election. The January 6th insurrection at the Capitol got a lot of attention, but I think much more dangerous was the vote later that same evening by most of the Republicans in Congress to decertify the electoral votes that had been cast and sent to Congress by the competitive battleground states in the 2020 election. The members of Congress who took that anti-democratic action suffered no penalty at the poll in the 2022 election. Most of them were overwhelmingly reelected. So I think we have a lot of evidence to suggest that in most times and places, ordinary people are going to care more about the quality of their daily lives and their political identities and values more than about the procedures of democracy. And if the procedures of democracy are going to be preserved, they're going to be preserved mostly by political leaders rather than by pressure for ordinary citizens. And that brings me to a broader point that I want to make about understanding democracy. I think our conventional theory of democracy is an obstacle to understanding what's happened in Europe in the 21st century. We have what my colleague Chris Aiken and I, in our book Democracy for Realists, called a folk theory of democracy, in which somehow or other ordinary people and public opinion are at the root of whatever happens in democratic political systems. Abraham Lincoln called this government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Well, if that's the case, then when democracy goes wrong, it must be because there's something wrong with ordinary people, with their attitudes or their behavior. If immigration is tearing Europe apart, it must be because anti-immigrant attitudes are on the rise, but as we've seen, they're not. If elites are squabbling over European integration, there must be a public backlash against the EU, but as we've seen, they're not. If populist parties are winning more seats in parliament, it must be because populist sentiments are exploding, but as we've seen, they're not. And if democracy erodes, it must be because support for democracy as a system of government has weakened, but as we've seen, it hasn't. In all these cases, analysts have looked to public opinion to explain what are really changes in elite behavior. This seems to me to be an instance of a point that a famous American political scientist made several decades ago. Our understanding of democratic politics is essentially simplistic, based on a tremendously exaggerated notion of the immediacy and urgency of the connection between public opinion and events. And as another political analyst said even longer ago, almost a century ago now, there are immense confusions in the current theory of democracy which frustrate and pervert its action. I've attacked certain of the confusions with no conviction, except that a false philosophy tends to stereotype thought against the lessons of experience. I do not know what the lessons will be when we learn to think of public opinion as it is, and not as the fictitious power we have assumed it to be. Well, I have to say that I don't know what the lessons will be either. This book is really a kind of critique of our contemporary understanding of democracy more than it is the development of an alternative theory of democracy. But it does seem to me that whatever theory of democracy we want to find our way toward, it's going to be one in which we take much more seriously than we do the importance of leadership and the ability of leaders to make politics and make democracy for better or worse. And so I want to just close by reading to you a couple of chapters from the very conclusion of the book. Politics is the adjustment or balance of interests by means ranging from battle and riot to abstract reasoning and sensitive morality. It is a difficult business, especially when political contention involves real or imagined threats to cherished social identities and values. The jobs of politicians is to manage the pressure arising from disagreement as efficiently as possible and as much as possible on the basis of reasoning and sensitive morality rather than battle and riot. We cannot analyze any bit of government very deeply without becoming aware that it is holding the balance between conflicting interests. In democratic politics, public opinion is a weighty manifestation of conflicting interests, though not at all the most accurate. It is also a resource to be organized and exploited by democratic leaders pursuing their own visions of the good. When they organize and exploit public opinion skillfully for good ends, including the good end of safeguarding democracy itself, they deserve our gratitude and respect. When they fail, that is a crisis of democracy. Thank you.
In hearing what you had to say, and it obviously raised so many questions. You know, it is about the research that you've done, showing that basically the apathy amongst voters, to some extent, staying relatively stable, but actually populist sentiments in some of the governments, in the leadership, increasing or backsliding from democracy, as you called it, once in power, raises some very interesting discussion points around direct democracy versus representative democracy versus any democracy at all. So we now come to the Q&A session, and it would be really useful if you could speak into the microphone if you're in the audience here, and I give everybody access to join us online as well in a second. So who wants to ask the first question in the room? Oh, Bharat, if you could just speak into the microphone.
Good evening to you from the United Kingdom. The main points I take from your presentation were there is a lot of inertia in defending democracy amongst the population. The trouble I find is with that inertia also comes misinformation and no consequences for the misinformation. Politicians may lie, cheat, promise the earth, and face no consequences when the lies are found to be lies. What can we do to make democracy more representative of the people?
Thank you, Bharat.
I think I'm pessimistic about the possibility of creating a system in which ordinary people can be very successful at monitoring lies and misinformation. I say that partly because the political system is just hugely complex. And I think with respect to the issue of democratic backsliding, it's particularly difficult because democracy itself is such a complex and contested set of ideas and procedures. Often what we see is argument about what it is that democracy means in a particular instance. If you think about Israel, for example, there have been complaints about the incumbent government trying to limit the role of the Supreme Court on the grounds that the Supreme Court is anti-democratic, but from another interpretation of democracy, having a Supreme Court and not letting the public opinion of the moment run roughshod over individual rights is one of the key tenets of democracy. And so often when you have arguments or political contests about democratic procedures, it's easy enough for citizens to gravitate toward the interpretation of democracy that's consistent with the views of political elites on their own side and convenient with respect to the political debate of the moment. I think it would be very hard for anyone, even an expert, to rule authoritatively about one side or the other of every procedural disagreement about democracy that arises in a political system. The other thing to say here is that although sometimes ordinary citizens seem apathetic about defending democracy, I think more often the issue is that they're willing to trade off the procedural values of democracy against the substantive values that they hold dear. And I think that's something that most of us would probably be willing to do, at least under some circumstances. There are very few people, I think, who would stand up for democracy as a procedure, even in circumstances where they knew that it was going to lead to complete disaster with respect to the values and the political views that they hold dearest and think are most important. So I think the trade-off between democratic procedures and the substantive values that people are pursuing through democracy is probably inevitable.
Okay. Many philosophers, including myself, are very annoying creatures because we always start a conversation, please define your terms. And I think this would probably be very apt in terms of a definition of democracy. And it's very easy for all of us to talk past each other by having a completely different interpretation of what we believe democracy is. But on to the next question. We've got, Larry, we've got a few in the room. The online audience are a bit shy in terms of showing their screens and asking questions directly, but we have lots of questions in the chat room. Speak directly.
Quite a long time ago, I attended a speech by Mikhail Gorbachev in which he made the point that democracy was very hard to accomplish without a sort of groundwork of grassroots organizations. And under communism, certainly in Poland, clubs that you have all over the place, charitable organizations, etc., even the Boy Scouts were just banned. They were not allowed. And I am wondering if the years of not having civic organizations like help groups or religion or anything in Hungary and Poland have contributed to that acceptance of authoritarianism in the government. Does that make sense?
It's a great question. There has been some work looking specifically at the strength of what's called civil society, the kinds of organizations that you're talking about in these various countries. And certainly on the whole, I would say civil society is less robust in Central and Eastern Europe than it is in Western Europe for the kinds of historical reasons that you're pointing to. But if you look within Central and Eastern Europe, it actually turns out that Hungary and Poland are among the most robust civil societies in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think drawing a direct connection between the poverty of these grassroots organizations and the backsliding that we've seen at the level of elite politics is probably somewhat too simple. A scholar in Hungary who's done this kind of analysis and tried to reason about why that is suggested that, what's more important is not the existence of these grassroots society, but rather their own political substantive values and their levels of commitment to democracy. So in Hungary and Poland, One of the most vibrant aspects of civil society is the Catholic Church, which has been, in both cases, pretty supportive of the incumbent government. They've been relatively, supportive of conservative social values and a kind of return to traditional culture and morality. And that's something that a lot of the grassroots Catholic organizations seem to have supported rather than resisted. So I think although these kinds of groups are sometimes helpful in organizing opposition to democratic backsliding, they're certainly not likely to be a panacea.
Okay, thank you for that. Just to remind people online, it's okay to unmute yourself and show the video and ask a question directly if you want to. In the meantime, I'm going to go to the online chat room for a second and read out the first question. First one is, as the leading Dutch political scientist and global authority on populism, Cas Mudde, has said, populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. I.e., liberal democracy is not very democratic. So why is the focus and assumptions always that it is the only right-wing populism which is the threat to democracy?
Well, again, a lot hinges here on how you want to think about democracy. My view, propounded in this book and also in the one that I mentioned previously, Democracy for Realists, is that democratic politics, like all politics, is mostly the business of politicians rather than of ordinary citizens. So I would say that, ordinary democracy as we think of it is mostly not a matter of ordinary citizens running things, nor is right-wing populist government a matter of ordinary citizens running things. So the two of them have that much in common. I'm less convinced that the support for right-wing populism has specifically to do with concerns about the, alienation from the mainstream political parties, or a sense that they've become out of touch with their voters. If you look at those kinds of attitudes, they just don't seem to be very strongly correlated at the individual level with support for specific right-wing populist parties. Mudde is a terrific scholar of populist politics. He figures as kind of a hero in the first chapter of my book because he's one of the people who I think has stood up against this narrative that we're in this crisis due to the populist wave. He says the right-wing populist parties mostly have been pretty unsuccessful at tapping this substantial reservoir of populist sentiment and are more a nuisance in at least Western European governments than they are a fundamental threat to democracy. So I agree with him about that part, but I am less impressed by the importance of perceptions of the out-of-touchness of mainstream politicians as the basis of that. I think it's simply a fact that in most democratic systems, most of the time, there are going to be significant numbers of people who are dissatisfied with how things are going. And if there are political entrepreneurs who are willing to organize to appeal for their support, and if the institutions provide avenues for them to translate that support into political influence, then we're going to see those parties having some influence.
Okay, thank you for that. We saw David and Peter flash up briefly over the last few minutes online. If you want to ask a question, please feel free to unmute your screens and unmute yourself and show the screen if you want to ask a question. We've got plenty to get going, though, in the chat room. One of the questions is, how connected are the various populist movements across Europe?
My sense is that they are increasingly connected at the level of, the political strategists behind these various movements, not only across Europe, but also with the US and other places. There's a kind of cottage industry of political consultants that's cropped up, as there always is when some movement seems to be on the upswing, to try to harness it and strategize about how to make it work. But I think the underlying issue here is not the extent to which they coordinate, but rather how much there is to coordinate around. In the wake of the pandemic, there was a kind of decline in continent-wide support for these right-wing populist parties and some talk that their wave had crested. Orban hosted what was supposed to be a kind of summit of right-wing populist leaders from all over Europe. And there were a total of 2 other populist leaders who attended. One was the Prime Minister of Poland, and the other was the leader of a right-wing party in Italy, not the one who subsequently became Prime Minister, but the one whose party was kind of collapsing at the time because he had bungled his role in the previous candidate. So that was a kind of low point in the coordination and strategy of international right-wing populism. But I do think there's an ongoing potential there, and one that politicians in a variety of places will probably continue to coordinate. And, as in Poland, the leader of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, as they were cracking down on the press and on the judicial systems, said to Orban, we've observed your example and we're following it. So clearly there are connections among these various developments in different places.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Peter, you're on the screen. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, thanks very much, Andreas. When I started observing politics, the received wisdom that to be successful and get a majority, and I agree this was in the British system with first past the post, but was actually to occupy the middle ground, not to go to extremes. You wanted actually to occupy it and make sure the other player didn't. A bit like playing squash, really. And that's how you won. Now, given these condottieri and of political freelancers from Australia or wherever, this is now not the received wisdom. Is somehow to appeal to your base, get them out to vote. So it's coming at it from the wings rather than the middle. Is this something that you've observed in looking at the rest of the world?
It's most obvious in two-party systems like yours and like mine. Political scientists for half a century have had a fancy mathematical version of this argument called the median voter theorem. The idea is that electoral competition would pressure both of the major parties to converge at the middle of the distribution of public opinion. Much of the previous book that I mentioned, Democracy for Realists, is to argue that the median voter theorem has never really worked. The reason is that the underlying mechanism that's supposed to drive that is that voters are supposed to carefully vote for the party whose ideological position on this dimension that we're thinking about is closest to their own. I think that vastly overstates the extent to which voters care about and act on the basis of ideology and political issues. My view is that much more important in most times and places is political identity of one kind or another, and especially in the context that we see in a fair number of contemporary democracies in which various major social groups, whether they're ethnic groups or religious groups or gender and sexual identity groups, are, education groups, occupational groups, are pretty closely aligned or affiliated with one party or the other. The role of issues in those kind of situations is mostly to allow these leaders who have the partisan loyalties of a large number of people to persuade them about how they should think about particular political issues. You see that even about an issue as fundamental as abortion in the US in the 1980s, as the political parties were taking increasingly strong stands about abortion. The Democratic Party became the party of pro-choice, the Republican Party became the party of pro-life, and we saw some people sorting themselves out. The public perception, I think, was that people in large numbers were changing their partisanship in order to bring it into line with their views about abortion. And for some people that did happen, but what happened more often, if you look at detailed long-term survey data about changes in people's attitudes, what happened more often was that Republicans who were pro-choice changed their mind about abortion and became pro-life, and Democrats who were pro-life changed their mind about abortion and became pro-choice. I think that's a more typical kind of use of ideology and issues in politics than the one that's underlying the neat and tidy theory in which the parties are forced to converge at the center. They're forced to appeal to the political identities and values of some substantial proportion of people. And depending upon how the party system is organized, that may have to be a majority or it may not. Sometimes third parties siphon off some of the vote. Sometimes people who aren't really entirely on board with the platform will vote for the party anyway because the alternative is viewed as being unsatisfactory. If you look at the Republican vote for Trump in his first run in 2016 in the United States, he managed to win the nomination because we have a nominating process that's quote unquote democratic in the sense that it gives a faction of very energized citizens a lot of control over the nomination. And so they managed to push Trump as the Republican nominee, even though he didn't have majority support within the Republican Party at large. But once he became the Republican nominee, 9 out of 10 Republicans voted for him, just as 9 out of 10 Republicans have voted for every other recent Republican presidential candidate, because they think of themselves as Republicans. He was the Republican candidate, and the Democratic candidate was someone they weren't going to support under any circumstances. So the underlying values of large numbers of people are certainly important, but also the way politicians appeal to them within a given set of electoral rules and a given party system, I think, are important as well.
Okay, thank you, Larry. We're still skirting around the issue of democracy as if it was something that we have to maintain. And, according to some people, democracy is the worst form of government, apart from all the other ones that have been tried before, according to Winston Churchill. And even the ancient Greeks who bestowed democracy upon us thought it was a terrible idea. So is democracy, this is a question for you, Larry, is democracy really tenable in view of the existential threats that face the earth now?
Well, in this book, Democracy for Realists, we tried to demolish the notion that democracy is what people often imagine, that is, ordinary citizens actually running a large-scale political system. I think that kind of democracy is and always has been untenable. That's much of what the Greeks were concerned about. At the level of their city-states, they were able to make democracy work in that sense, but they were concerned about the effects that it would have on substantive political values, and whether they were right or wrong on that score, I think depends a lot on the relative, civic education and commitment to humane values of political elites and ordinary people in any given time or place. So I think that part is kind of up for grabs. I do think that democratic systems sometimes get into trouble when they try to be too democratic in a conventional sense. The instance of Trump winning the Republican nomination in the US in 2016 is a really striking and frightening example of that in my country. David Cameron blundering into letting citizens vote on staying in the EU, I think, is another pretty dramatic example in your country. Those were instances in which the pressure to behave democratically produced what seemed to me to be substantively bad political outcomes. But we didn't in that book abandon a commitment to democracy in a broader sense. And in the final chapter of the book, we tried to say what was good about democracy in this more minimal sense that we had in mind. And even some of those minimal arguments for democracy, I think, have taken a hit in recent years. One of the things we said when this book was published in the spring of 2016 was that, well, even if the government turns out to be incompetent, at least a democratic election makes it possible for people to agree on who won the election without having violence in the wake of the election to decide who's going to exercise power. Well, that seems to be somewhat less taken for granted than it was when we wrote it then. We also said that there is some pressure for politicians to avoid trampling on what are at least broadly held consensual values of ordinary citizens. The example we gave that no US president would be caught strangling a kitten on the White House lawn in front of the television cameras. Well, several months later, Trump bragged about the fact that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and his supporters wouldn't care. So maybe that one has to be tempered down a bit as well. But we do think, just looking historically, that democratic systems tend to perform somewhat better overall in terms of protecting individual rights and freedoms, in terms of avoiding the worst kinds of policy errors that really fanatical anti-democratic governments can get into in places like, Mao's China or Cambodia. And so we do think that democracy is worth preserving in some sense, but nonetheless, it's hard to say exactly what that means or how it is that we preserve it in any particular political context.
Okay, thank you for that. You heard it from the horse's mouth first. Vote for the least incompetent person. We've got 2 questions in the room, and then we go back to online.
I believe that if you go out into the streets of Bath and the area of Queen Square, just outside our building here, and ask your average citizen of Bath what they think about politics, they will tend to answer, I think, not much. They don't think about politics much, and only perhaps when a general election comes around, which is only every 5 years. Is that sort of lack of interest in politics the thing that is most likely to produce a rise of extreme politics on left or right, in your opinion?
It is generally the case in democratic systems that most citizens, most of the time, are pretty inattentive and disengaged, and those people do historically seem to be most susceptible to kind of waves of enthusiasm for extreme parties or extreme figures because they haven't been indoctrinated in more conventional political views and loyalties. So I think, yes, that set of people, it contributes to the dangers of a democratic system getting seriously off the rails. The additional caution that I want to add, though, is that the people in that room who do pay a lot of attention to politics may not be so great either. They have better rehearsed and more consistent and coherent political ideologies and opinions, mostly because they've practiced absorbing the arguments of the people on their own side of the political spectrum. If you look, for example, at people's susceptibility to misinformation, somebody raised that in a question earlier, the people who are most susceptible to misinformation generally are not the people who are least informed about politics, because they're not sufficiently clued in to even absorb the misinformation, much less the corrected information. The people who are most likely to be misinformed are the people who are moderately interested and moderately attentive to political discourse and know just enough to understand what the argument is that the people on their side of the political spectrum would like them to believe, what's convenient for their side to believe, and they adopt that and consistently stick with it even in the face of counter arguments. So the people who are hardest to talk out of their misinformation are the people who are moderately well-informed loyalists of one political party or another.
Professor Birtles, how much I've enjoyed your presentation tonight. I'm neither a philosopher or a politician. I'm another P. I'm a psychiatrist, or I was. And I have reservations about assuming the veracity of people's response to questionnaires in terms of particularly the fact that when quite clearly we're living in a society in which we're becoming increasingly right-wing, in which we're increasingly less concerned about the truth and honesty of politics, in which we are accepting a greater divide between the haves and the have-nots. When we then say that we're quite happy with politics, then we must be moving with it as a population. And there is an explanation for this in psychiatry. It's called Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, that if you don't sort of go along with the flow, then you cause yourself a great deal of unhappiness. How would you comment on that observation?
I think there is some of that going on. The people adjust themselves to all kinds of circumstances. It seems to me that the even more powerful and probably universal application of that idea is in terms of people's thinking about their own party and their own political leaders and finding ways to justify whatever their own political leaders and their own party do, even things that from some objective perspective, or maybe if you could think about what they would have believed under other circumstances before they adopted these loyalties, they actually said. There's been a lot of research that tries to get at, especially in the specific area of misinformation, if people seem to subscribe to wacky factual premises of one kind or another, to try to figure out whether those are simply, preferences that they pretend to have in order to express themselves in a survey, or whether they're things that they actually act on politically. And it's a complicated, not all that successful literature, but for the most part, it seems to me to suggest that these are genuine sentiments that people have, even if they're generated in the first instance by the kinds of psychological processes that you described, and people are likely to act upon them. There are some interesting cases in which people have been offered monetary rewards for providing correct answers to factual questions in surveys, even if those answers might be embarrassing for their political sympathies. Questions about whether the unemployment rate increased or decreased when their party was in power, or whether the national debt is going up or down, those kinds of factual questions. People are slightly more likely to provide factual answers if you pay them for doing so. That suggests that on the margin, some of these responses are a kind of expressive, symbolic expression rather than a real factual attitude. But those effects are really very small. If you cost it out, it would cost billions and billions of pounds to correct most people's views about even a single item of misinformation across the country as a whole. And so to think that that would be a way to improve the attitudes that voters bring to the voting booth, I think is probably misleading or not very successful. But yes to the notion that people's political attitudes do in significant part stem from these very basic psychological processes. No to the view that we should therefore not pay too much attention to what they say in surveys.
Okay, great. Peter has disappeared again. Oh, no, he's back. Peter, would you like to have another bite at the cherry and ask your second question?
Well, that's very kind of you. One thing that has occurred to me as this debate has gone on is, for instance, what I think is a mistaken statement that Cameron's decision to have a referendum on Europe had anything to do with democracy. It had everything to do with internal debate within his own party, and he thought he could busk it, rather than following a rule that you never hold a referendum unless you're confident of the result. But this leads me to why a Brexit party was basically able to take over the Conservative Party and therefore, in a way, invalidate your graph of the diminishing right-wing vote in this country, because, in fact, the Conservatives had moved decidedly right, a bit like the Republicans, let's say. So what I observed was the Mail, for instance, in this country, actually driving the whole debate. The Conservatives who were in power looked at the Mail and took their cue from it because they knew that their core electorate was going to do so. Fox News is clearly in the news, as it should be. And I can't comment about the media, I'm afraid, in Europe, apart from people in Hungary and Poland wanting to dominate it and suborn it to their wishes. But what do you think is the role of the media? And I'm talking about traditional media, because what's happening elsewhere is very difficult to work out. What do you think is the role of, let's say, the Murdochs of this world in democracy?
Thanks. I think there are a series of really interesting questions there. First, about Cameron, I agree. What I tried to suggest was that he blundered into setting up this referendum. I think that was, as you say, a miscalculation with respect to where the Conservative Party stood vis-a-vis UKIP. And I think it's an instance of a broader pattern in which mainstream politicians have made the political situation worse by exaggerating or overestimating the strength of these right-wing populist parties in circumstances where they couldn't have much direct control. The argument for having a referendum, I do think, was grounded in significant part in the idea that that would be a democratic thing to do, quote unquote. Why was there sentiment in favor of a referendum in the first place? I think the sentiment was one problem for the system, and Cameron's giving into it was a second. It is the case that the Tory party has, in the wake of Brexit, become not only a more consistently Brexit party, but also adopted some of the other right-wing populist positions that UKIP had championed, probably most importantly with respect to immigration. Excuse me, I think that too reflects a political miscalculation when, in the wake of Brexit, the Tories started moving, quote unquote, to the right. Public opinion in Britain was already moving away from right-wing populist sentiment. One of the graphs I showed, anti-immigrant sentiment, for example, was waning in Britain in the immediate wake of the Brexit vote, and anti-EU sentiment was also waning. So they were, I think, behind the times in terms of responding to a sentiment that had already shifted. The media are important here. I think a lot has to do with the structure of the media, which generates their economic incentives. For a lot of times in a lot of these countries, certainly in the US for most of the middle of the 20th century, and certainly in Britain for most of that period, and still to some extent in many Western European countries. Excuse me, television has been a unifying force because television networks have had to appeal to broad audiences economically in order to succeed, or in order to get government support and keep government support. And so they probably on the whole were having a kind of moderating influence on politics and keeping it stuck to the mainstream, even in circumstances where there were significant extremist sentiment of one kind or another. In the US, for example, anti-immigrant sentiment existed in substantial part for a long time and was being submerged by the political system, partly by the media and partly by the Republican Party leadership. That's no longer true, in part because of this shift in the media. Cable news, Fox News in particular, has an economic incentive to appeal to a very attentive and highly interested segment of the audience, and so they become divisive factors in the political landscape rather than unifying factors. In the US, that's been less true of newspapers, since in most places now there are so few local newspapers that they have to appeal to a broad local readership in order to succeed. Whereas in Britain, you still have national newspapers that can succeed economically by appealing to particular slices of the political spectrum, and succeed by rabble-rousing and playing to a extremist audience rather than moderating the political discussion.
Okay, well, I think we've had quite a journey on democracy from Europe, around the globe, and then ending up in Bath, invariably on the topic of Brexit. You know, nothing changes in the world, just like the reservoir of populism. Larry, before we say thank you to you, can the online audience please just unmute and thank Larry and the audience here for a fantastic talk. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.
Excellent, and perhaps next time you can be here in person with us. That would be fantastic, Larry. Just before we finish, just a couple of announcements, what's happening next with the World Affairs series. So next month, we have a talk on living with intelligent machines. So, you know, it's not just AI in the abstract, it's about AI, actually, how we live with intelligent machines in our home. And whether you call them intelligent or not is up to you. And then in June and July, we have a series of weekly talks on the subject of the world in 2050. And that is a weekly talks covering subjects like economics, politics, society, technology, and of course, very importantly, the climate. So hopefully you will join us in May for Intelligent Machines, and then the World in 2050 series in June and in July. All that remains me to say is have a safe journey home. See you next time. All the very best. Bye-bye, Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.